Welcome to the APHIS Veterinary Services Chronic Wasting Disease Herd Certification Program training. This training will help you become familiar with and better understand the program requirements. Before getting into the program details, we will first give an overview of the history of the CWD Herd Certification Program, or HCP, and its overarching goals. The goal of the CWD Herd Certification Program is to provide a consistent national approach to control the incidence of CWD in farm cervids and prevent the interstate spread of CWD in farm cervids. It is illegal to move the CWD susceptible species listed in the Code of Federal Regulations interstate. States cannot agree to accept animals from another state if the herd is not HCP certified. The HCP arose from a need to standardize the requirements for interstate movement of cervids. Development began in 2003, the HCP was established in 2006, and the proposed rule was published in 2009. An interim rule became effective in 2012, and the final rule became effective in 2014. In 2016, a working group was initiated that proposed various changes to the HCP program standards. The changes were made available for public comment in 2018 and became effective in 2019. We are currently utilizing those updated standards for the HCP. The Code of Federal Regulations, commonly referred to as the CFR, is a codification of the general and permanent rules that are published from the executive departments and agencies of the federal government. 9 CFR, parts 55 and 81, are the rules relating to the control of CWD and are considered legally binding. Part 55 of 9 CFR addresses the control of CWD, including the HCP, while Part 81 addresses the interstate movement of deer, elk, and moose. Parts 55 and 81 of the CFR can be found on the APHIS Cervid Health website on the CWD page. We recommend reading these rules so you're familiar with them. The HCP is a cooperative effort between APHIS, state animal health officials, and farm cervid owners to control the spread of CWD, and participation is voluntary. While the program origin is federal, states that participate in the program agree to follow its requirements and administer it in their state. There are some important limitations to federal authority related to farm cervids. Unlike states, APHIS cannot require HCP participation, depopulation of herds affected by CWD, or compliance with HCP requirements in herds that are not enrolled in the HCP. There are a number of requirements for states that wish to participate in the HCP. We will go over those in this section. Currently, 28 states participate in the HCP, and those states can be seen on the map in green. As of October of 2021, 1,519 deer herds were enrolled in the HCP, and 1,212 of those were HCP certified. There were 302 elk herds enrolled, and 265 of those were certified. And 138 mixed species herds were enrolled, and 97 of those were certified. For a state to participate in the HCP, they must have the legal authority to quarantine herds and restrict intrastate movement, require the prompt reporting of the detection of CWD, and have a signed Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, with APHIS Veterinary Services. HCP participating states are required to submit annual reports that summarize data for farm cervids in their state. We use this information to understand farm cervid participation and produce the yearly summary seen at USHA. The annual report is due by August 1st of each year and is submitted to the DIS system. Annual reports must include the number of cervids tested for CWD, the species present in the state and the number of herds and animals, CWD test results, the number of each herd type present in the state, the number of herds under quarantine that are CWD positive, the number of herds that have been depopulated due to CWD, and the number of herds released from quarantine. There is also a request for information related to CWD trace investigations. The Cervid Health Program has begun to conduct state program reviews to identify HCP compliance issues and help states improve their program compliance. HCP compliance is essential to program integrity and efficacy. States must meet the minimum HCP requirements, but always have the option to implement rules and regulations that go beyond those of the HCP. State program rules must include all HCP requirements. If not, the state is not in compliance. In this section, we will go into detail on the HCP program standards, what they are, and what is their function. The requirements in the program standards are not optional. Part 55.21 of the CFR states that herds participating in the HCP are to be in compliance with the CWD Herd Certification Program standards. The CWD Herd Certification Program standards provide detailed descriptions of acceptable methods for complying with all the legal requirements in 9 CFR Parts 55 and 81. The CFR lists specific cervid species that were known to be susceptible to CWD at the time of its writing: deer, elk, and moose. These species are regulated under the APHIS Interstate HCP movement requirements. Since the time of writing CFR Parts 55 and 81, more species have been found to be susceptible to CWD via natural routes of exposure. These include reindeer, cyca deer, and muntjac. However, those species are currently not required to be certified in the HCP to move interstate. This may change if the CFR is open for revision in the future. It is at the state animal health official's discretion whether to allow these species to enter their state or not. To ensure efficacy and confidence in the HCP, states must enforce the CWD HCP requirements. In this section, we will discuss each of the HCP requirements in detail. We will begin with herd enrollment requirements. Owners wishing to enroll in the HCP must maintain accurate records, have a unique premises ID, have adequate fencing, and pass the initial inspection as outlined in the program standards. Additionally, each animal must have 2 forms of ID by the age of 12 months, one of which is a USDA-approved official ID and one that is a unique herd tag. Commingling of HCP-enrolled cervids with other cervids is strictly prohibited. This means there can be no direct contact with other cervids, there can be no shared equipment, pasture, or water sources, and there can be no movement of fawns to and from bottle feeding operations. Animals are also considered commingled if they've been within 10 feet of another cervid, had contact with a CWD positive animal or contaminated premises within the last 5 years. HCP enrolled or certified herds may only add animals to their herd that are of equal or greater HCP status in order to retain their HCP status. Herds adding animals from a lower status herd must be reduced to the status of those animals. New herds can gain immediate enrolled or certified status if the following criteria are met. The new herd is comprised exclusively of animals that are from compliant HCP enrolled or certified herds, and the new herd enrolls in the HCP and complies with all of its requirements. An initial inspection is required to ensure the new herd has acceptable records, animal identification, structurally sound fencing, does not share equipment or handling facilities with other cervids, and is greater than 30 feet from any existing cervids. Animal identification is an integral part of the HCP. All animals over 12 months of age must have 2 unique forms of ID, with at least one being an official ID approved by APHIS, and 1 unique herd ID. These IDs must be linked to that animal and herd in a state database. 2 forms of ID are required for interstate movement regardless of age. Herds participating in the HCP must have adequate fencing. This means the fence must be at least 8 feet high, compliant with any state requirements, be structurally sound to prevent ingress or egress of cervids, and be maintained. This includes fixing areas that wash out under the fence. In order to participate in the HCP, owners must keep accurate records and retain those records for at least 5 years. The most crucial type of record is the herd inventory. An inventory must include the age, sex, species, all associated IDs, origin and disposition, date of birth, date of death, and official CWD testing reports. If an animal is sold, the inventory must include information on the date of the sale and who purchased the animal and their address. Herd inventories are an integral part of annual herd inspections, as well as for herd advancement and certification. States ensure that herds wishing to enroll in the HCP meet all requirements by conducting or reviewing the initial site inspection, which includes confirming a match between animal IDs and herd inventory, evaluating the animals for any signs of clinical CWD, inspecting the fence, assuring 2 forms of ID are present, as described in a previous slide, assigning an enrollment date, and providing a certificate of HCP enrollment. The initial HCP herd inspection must be done no sooner than 12 months prior to enrollment. In this section, requirements for herd advancement and certification will be reviewed. HCP herd enrollment status, certification, and advancement are all dependent upon the herd's compliance with HCP requirements. A herd may not advance in status or become certified if it is not in compliance. Once certified, a herd must continue to meet all HCP requirements or have its status reduced. Lack of compliance with HCP requirements must be addressed. In this section, we will discuss herd inspections and inventories. While annual inspections can be done by APHIS, state staff, or accredited veterinarians, states must assure that annual site inspections are done within the allotted time frame and include the necessary components. Annual inspections must be conducted no earlier than 11 months and no later than 13 months after the herd enrollment date. This inspection includes the observation of animals for signs of clinical CWD and verifying that the fence is of an acceptable height and is structurally sound to keep the farm cervids in and the wild cervids out of the facility. In addition to the annual site inspection, an annual records review must be conducted. States must verify that the herd inventory is complete and is reconciled with that of the previous year. Additionally, states must confirm that 100% of mortalities were tested for CWD, had the correct samples submitted within 7 days of death, and were of sufficient quality to produce viable test results. If compliance issues are discovered, corrective action should be taken. Physical herd inspections are conducted no more than 3 years after the last complete physical inspection. The physical herd inspection includes the same parameters as the annual inspection, with the addition of the visual verification of all IDs present on the animals and comparison with the herd inventory. Any ID that cannot be visually inspected will require the restraint or immobilization of the animal at the owner's expense. As with the annual inspection, the state must verify that the physical inspection has been conducted, as well as reconcile the herd inventory as described on the previous slide. Animal escapes. Animal escapes must be reported immediately to state animal health officials upon discovery. Consequences and recapture regulations vary between states. In this section, we will go into the details of CWD surveillance and sampling. Owners must report any signs of neurological dysfunction or wasting immediately to state animal health officials, APHIS, or an accredited veterinarian. CWD suspects should be euthanized and tested for CWD, as described in the CWD program standards. All mortalities in cervids 12 months of age or older must be reported to state animal health officials and tested for CWD. This includes animals sent to slaughter and those released to hunt preserves under the same ownership. Owners must arrange for the collection of the appropriate samples for CWD testing and submit them to an approved non-laboratory within 7 days of death. Owners are also responsible for the appropriate disposal of carcasses. States must confirm that 100% of mortalities over 12 months of age are tested for CWD, verify that the correct sample types have been submitted for testing, and that the samples are viable for testing. States must also verify that samples have been submitted for testing within 7 days of death, place any herds with CWD suspect animals under quarantine, and enforce consequences for missed or unusable samples. In this section, we will describe who can collect samples, what samples are to be collected, how they're to be prepared, and where they must be sent. CWD surveillance samples can only be collected by state animal health officials, APHIS employees, accredited veterinarians, or in some states, certified CWD sample collectors. Both the medial retropharyngeal lymph nodes and OBEX need to be submitted for CWD testing. Early cases of CWD are only positive in the medial retropharyngeal lymph nodes in deer. Therefore, testing only OBEX samples will miss all early cases. Additionally, knowing if an animal is positive in one or both tissues can be informative for epidemiological investigations. Both fixed and fresh samples are to be submitted for HCP CWD testing. The OBEX proper is to be placed into an appropriately labeled jar of 10% formalin, as seen in this image. The trimmings from the OBEX, which are brainstem, are to be placed into a whirl pack. Keep the fresh tissue chilled after collection and during shipping. CWD can have unilateral distribution in the lymph nodes, so both medial retropharyngeal lymph nodes should be tested. Cut each medial retropharyngeal lymph node longitudinally, placing half of the left and half of the right into the 10% formalin jar with the OBEX. After placing half of the medial retropharyngeal lymph nodes in formalin, place the other halves in the whirl pack with the brainstem samples. Keep the fresh tissue chilled after collection and during shipping. On occasion, animal identification has to be confirmed and tissue matching conducted. In addition to the standard regulatory samples for CWD, the official ID with a piece of ear tissue attached must also be submitted. Please place the ID with a piece of ear no smaller than a quarter in a whirl pack and submit fresh with the rest of the samples. Do not place in formalin, as it makes DNA extraction more difficult if tissue matching is needed. The ID must have tissue attached. CWD samples need to be submitted to a NALM laboratory that is approved to conduct CWD testing within 7 days of death. Caching of samples is not permitted. NALM laboratories may only use USDA-approved methods for CWD testing and must be approved to conduct immunohistochemistry, or IHC, for standard CWD surveillance, or ELISA for slaughter surveillance. ELISA may not be used for standard CWD surveillance in HCP herds. It is the owner's responsibility to ensure complete, good quality samples are collected and all sampling requirements are met. Poor quality and missing samples undermine the ability to assess the status of CWD in a herd, and consequently negatively impact the efficacy of the CWD herd certification program. Poor quality samples are those that are severely autolyzed, are the wrong tissue type, or from the wrong location within the correct tissue type, This is most commonly seen with OBEX submissions. Missing samples are those that are not submitted for testing at all. As a reminder, both the OBEX and the medial retropharyngeal lymph nodes are required for HCP herd testing. Unfortunately, it is not uncommon for individuals that collect CWD samples to have deficiencies in their collection skills. States must keep an eye out for sampling deficiencies, such as repeated submissions from the wrong location, or failure to submit both the medial retropharyngeal lymph nodes and OBEX. When identified, states should contact the sample collector and offer training to correct the deficiency. If the deficiency is not corrected, or the collector fails to cooperate with efforts to improve their collection skills, states can prohibit them from collecting and submitting CWD samples, as the herd may have its status suspended or revoked as a result of missed or poor quality samples. Because the integrity of the HCP is dependent upon the collection of viable CWD samples, submission of poor quality or missed samples must have consequences. Every herd has the occasional missed sample. However, multiple sampling issues must be addressed through the reduction of herd status, suspension of status, or when the circumstances are appropriate, replacement of missed or poor quality samples with antemortem samples. We will talk about sample replacement in the next slide. Veterinary Services has developed a strategy to allow the replacement of missing or poor quality samples with antemortem samples. Approval for this option is being finalized. In order to be considered for this option, a herd must meet the following criteria. The herd is comprised exclusively of white-tailed deer and is fully compliant with all HCP requirements. And this option must be acceptable to both the AVIC and the state animal health officials prior to offering the option to the herd owner. To determine herd compliance, the AVIC and the state animal health officials must review inspection reports and CWD mortality testing from the previous 3 years. The AVIC and state animal health officials must agree in writing that the herd meets all HCP requirements. At this time, only herds that are not breeding to increase the S allele at codon 96 of the prion gene are eligible for this option. CWD detection sensitivity is decreased in deer that have 1 or 2 copies of the S allele at codon 96. If the genotype of the animals is unknown, the owner must genotype them. If the codon 96 genotype has already been conducted, antemortem testing must be done on at least 4 codon 96 GG deer. Rectal biopsy using IHC diagnostic testing is the only approved method for this antemortem option. 5 deer must be antemortem tested for each missed or poor quality sample. Replacement deer must be between 2 and 4 years of age and have had the longest exposure to the animal with the missed or poor quality mortality sample. Collection of antemortem rectal biopsies must be done by a state or federal veterinarian, or by an accredited veterinarian under the supervision of a state or federal veterinarian. Once collected, the samples are to be submitted to NVSL at the owner's expense. Antemortem rectal biopsy samples must have at least 6 follicles present to be viable. Animals with an insufficient number of follicles must be resampled. If this seems complicated, not to worry. Veterinary Services has a guidance document that outlines the parameters for this testing option. In this section, we will discuss epidemiological investigations associated with CWD suspect or positive animals. Upon confirmation of a CWD positive animal, the state must place all known CWD positive, exposed, epi-linked and trace herds, and suspect animals under quarantine, stopping all movement until the epi investigation determines the status of the exposed animals. Additionally, the state, in cooperation with APHIS, conducts an investigation to determine the locations where the CWD positive animal and CWD exposed animals from the herd resided in the last 5 years or 60 months. Upon discovery of a new CWD positive herd, Veterinary Services requests that states complete a preliminary EPI report. A copy of this report is in Appendix 3 of the program standards, and a fill-in-the-blank version can be provided upon request. The epidemiological investigation must start within 7 business days, and the index herd placed under quarantine. States must identify all trace-back and trace-out herds and animals, and report out-of-state traces to the appropriate state's animal health officials as soon as possible. In this section, we will review which herds are required to be placed under quarantine. The identification of herds to place under quarantine following the detection of a CWD positive animal can be complicated. We will take a look at the specifics surrounding CWD traces and the placement of quarantines. A CWD positive herd is where the CWD positive animal resided at the time of diagnosis, and an epi-link trace forward herd is a herd where an animal from a CWD positive herd has moved to. In this image, the CWD positive index case is shown as a red deer, and the CWD exposed deer are depicted in yellow with red borders. CWD exposed animals are animals that are part of a CWD positive herd, were exposed to the CWD positive animal or contaminated premises within the last 5 years. The appropriate action for epi-link trace forward herds can be seen here. This herd must be placed under quarantine. If the animal is no longer in the herd or was not tested for CWD upon its death, the herd is placed on a 5-year quarantine based on the last exposure to the CWD exposed animal or animals. A herd with this circumstance may be candidate for the use of antemortem testing to reduce quarantine time. The specific requirements for that option will be addressed shortly. If the animal is still residing in the trace forward herd, the herd owner has the option to euthanize the exposed animal and test for CWD. If the test is non-detect, the herd may be released from quarantine. If the test is positive, the herd becomes a CWD positive herd. In the next section, we will discuss herds that have a relationship to the CWD positive herd through the sale of the CWD positive animal. These are CWD exposed herds, and seen here surrounded by the green rectangles. CWD exposed herds are herds where the CWD positive animal has resided within the 5 years prior to being diagnosed with CWD. The appropriate action for CWD exposed herds can be seen here. CWD exposed herds must be placed under a 5-year quarantine based on the last exposure to the CWD positive animal. A herd with this circumstance may also be a candidate for the use of antemortem testing to reduce quarantine time. A trace-out epi-linked herd, as seen in this schematic as a blue rectangle, are herds that received animals from a CWD exposed herd. The quarantine status of a trace-out herd is dependent upon the CWD testing outcome of the CWD exposed animal. If the animal is still present, it can be euthanized and tested. A non-detect result would lift the quarantine. If an owner does not wish to euthanize and test the animal, or the animal has died without testing, the herd remains on quarantine. These herds may be appropriate for an antemortem testing option. A pass-through herd is a herd in which a CWD exposed animal has resided within the last 5 years, but no longer resides. They can be seen here in the peach rectangles in the center. Because CWD can be shed in urine, feces, and saliva, the status of the pass-through herd is based on the CWD testing outcome of the CWD exposed animal that resided there. If the animal has died and was found to be non-detect for CWD, the pass-through herd does not need to be placed under quarantine. If the CWD exposed animal was not tested for CWD, the status of the pass-through herd is based on an epidemiological investigation. The HCP assumes the positive animal traced back to an exposed herd is the first positive animal in the exposed herd. Therefore, animals that left the herd before the birth or purchase of the CWD positive animal are not considered exposed and are not traced out. Additionally, exposed animals that do not test positive are only traced forward to the herds where they resided after being exposed to the positive animal. They are also not traced back to their herd of origin. As mentioned in previous slides, some white-tailed deer herds may be eligible for antemortem testing to reduce their quarantine time. CWD positive herds are not eligible, but epi-linked and CWD exposed white-tailed deer herds can be if trace animals were not tested, or the owner does not wish to euthanize and test, or if it is unclear if the CWD positive animal was already infected at the time it entered the CWD positive herd. Elk and other cervid species are not currently eligible for this option. An approved quarantine can be reduced if 2 whole herd antemortem IHC rectal biopsy tests are done, as well as codon 96 genetic testing. Rectal biopsy samples must be collected by a state or federal VMO or an accredited veterinarian with state or federal collection oversight, and the samples sent to NVSL for IHC testing. For a herd to be eligible to reduce a quarantine by antemortem testing, the herd must be comprised of at least 50% GG animals due to the low sensitivity of rectal biopsy antemortem testing in GS and SS animals. Samples for the genetic testing may be collected prior to antemortem sampling or at the same time. EDTA blood samples can be sent to GeneCheck or other scrapie-approved labs that do deer codon 96 testing, or ear punches can be sent to the North American Deer Registry, where codon 96 is part of the data provided with whole herd predictive genetics. All testing and sampling is at owner expense. A herd is eligible for the first whole herd testing option no sooner than 24 months after the last known exposure to the CWD positive or exposed animal. The second whole herd test can be conducted no sooner than 6 months after the first. The following parameters are required for a herd to utilize the whole herd antemortem testing option to reduce quarantine time in CWD exposed or trace out herds. The antemortem testing needs to be included in the herd plan. The herd must have no fewer than 50% codon 96 GG deer. In herds with fewer than 50% codon 96 GG deer cannot participate. If more than 10% of the samples are not usable, the missed animals must be resampled to move forward to the second whole herd test. We will cover herd plans in this section, what they are, who writes them, and what they should contain. Herd plans describe in detail the actions to be taken to control the spread of CWD from and within CWD positive, exposed, epi-linked, or suspect herds. It is a herd and/or premise management agreement based on risk evaluation. Herd plans are cooperatively developed by the state, APHIS, and the herd owner. A signed herd plan is required to receive federal indemnity. A herd plan should be drafted and signed by the owner within 60 days of diagnosis and minimally include the ID of the animals, a regular examination of animals for signs of clinical CWD, reporting of clinical signs to state animal health officials, a requirement to maintain birth and death records, testing of all mortalities regardless of age, and biosecurity recommendations. Depopulation can be included in the original herd plan draft or added later as an amendment. A herd plan can also include depopulation parameters, the time the site must remain free of cervids, any plan to antemortem test, fencing requirements, equipment use restrictions, cleaning and disinfection parameters, and current CWD guidelines to prevent potential human exposure to CWD. In this section, federal indemnity will be discussed. Federal indemnity may be available for the purchase, destruction, and disposal of CWD positive, exposed, and suspect animals. There are several factors that can affect the availability of indemnity funds, including assigned federal budget, amount allotted for indemnity from Congress, and approval by veterinary services leadership. Continuing resolutions can significantly affect the ability of veterinary services to provide indemnity. There have been significant changes made to indemnity in 2022 related to animal valuation. The DEER calculator is no longer available for use to develop animal values. The USDA APHIS Veterinary Services Indemnity Values Specialty Table is now in use for this purpose. This table has flat values based on species, sex, and age. The values on the table may be significantly lower than the marketable value of the animals. Herd owners may wish to appeal these values and can do so by informing APHIS in writing within 14 days of the receipt of the indemnity proposal. Owners requesting an appeal must have the herd appraised by a certified third-party appraiser at their expense. Appraiser qualification standards set for private appraisers can be found at the Appraisal Foundation. Once it's determined that the owner wishes to request indemnity, the state animal health official, veterinary services epidemiologist, or veterinary medical officer will complete the indemnity request form and the preliminary epidemiology report found in Appendix 3 of the CWD program standards, then submit to the Veterinary Services Area Veterinarian in Charge, or AVIC. The AVIC will review the request, sign, and submit all documents to the Servant Health team. The VS 123 must also be completed and signed, but not until the request has been approved and the depopulation is imminent. There are some important things to know about indemnity. APHIS cannot purchase dead animals, so animals that die prior to the signing of the VS 123 will not be indemnified. APHIS will pay reasonable costs for the destruction and disposal of carcasses for animals that are indemnified. Once euthanized, the carcass becomes the property of APHIS, and APHIS may collect tissue samples to further CWD research. Unfortunately, there's often not enough funding to purchase all herds that have requested indemnity. As a result, we have developed a transparent prioritization process for selecting high-priority herds, and that can be found in Part B, 6.4 of the CWD program standards. The Servant Health Program will not deny indemnity based on lack of funds, but will review each herd based on the priority criteria. If a herd is considered low priority, there still may be funds available at the end of the fiscal year. Each low priority herd will be held in the indemnity queue and reassessed at that time. Herd prioritization is dependent upon the availability of funds, herd size, herd status with CWD positive herds being a higher priority than whole herds with CWD exposed or suspect animals, and the type of herd. Breeding herds take priority over hunt preserves. HCP status is also taken into consideration, with enrolled and compliant herds being higher priority than non-compliant or non-enrolled herds. Herds where CWD is not endemic in wildlife are higher priority than those in a CWD endemic area. The value of postmortem samples to inform epidemiology or with high research value may be prioritized. The final section in this training is herd depopulation. APHIS typically only depopulates whole herds. However, as whole herd predictive genetics research has progressed, APHIS may consider predictive genetic values in a depopulation strategy depending on CWD prevalence. In general, depopulation specifics must be included in a herd plan, either in the original or as an amendment. Carcasses must be appropriately disposed of. All animals must be tested for CWD following HCP sample parameters. And the cleaning and disinfection of premises must be completed prior to the AVIC signing off for the payment of indemnity. When a herd is depopulated, several things should be kept in mind while planning the operation. Efforts need to be made to keep the depopulation site as clean as possible. This can be done by employing plastic tarps, wood shavings, and disposable instruments. Regular disinfectants do not inactivate infectious prions. A 20,000 parts per million bleach solution should be used on all surfaces, equipment, and vehicles. And finally, CWD and other prions can remain infectious in the environment for many years. There are a lot of components to the CWD herd certification program, but the APHIS VS Cervid Health staff is here to help. If you have questions about program requirements, CWD disease specifics, or complex circumstances, please reach out.